Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we speak with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Hampton Lintorn Catlin, who is the CEO of Veue. Hampton is most known as the open source creator of Haml and Sass. Hampton Lintorn Catlin, welcome to Maintainable.
Hi. That's my normal greeting to everywhere I go.
Beautiful. I know it's been several years, I think, since we've seen each other in person. I guess this is the closest we've seen each other in a long time, but it's good to get to chat with you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. And given your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common traits of well-maintained software?
I feel like I could spend 6 hours answering that, which I guess is why you've made an entire podcast on that subject. But I'm going to go with the simplest answer, which is that it is actively changed and worked on, and there are not dead parts of code. And by dead parts, I mean parts of the code that have not been modified in a long time. That is a smell. And I mean, obviously there's like a million more things, but yeah, you pop into a open source repo and you see those like last changed at or test directories that haven't been modified in years. You're like, okay, well, nobody's loving this right now.
What if that area code is actually being executed all the time? Is there kind of a distinction there between, well, maybe it doesn't need to be changed because it just works?
I'm not saying that it's not valuable, to have a project that, isn't actively maintained, that, is just stable. So, I for a while and was a foster parent to the Mini Magic gym, which there's been 2 or 3 of us who've kind of just inherited, or just randomly somebody for 2 or 3 years will maintain it. So I did that maybe 5 years ago. Yeah, look, we didn't change a lot, just kept up with Ruby changes or things that needed to happen, or, every once in a while there'd be some bug report or a refactor of something. But yeah, for the most part, it's a very simple thing. And so, I would say that probably there was a commit at least once a year. And once you get past that, but yeah. I mean, look, I have a lot of repos that sit there, but I wouldn't call them well maintained. So Haml right now at this point is not super well maintained, and that's partly my fault. But that's what happens. And to me, that's part of the definition of maintenance, is that it is actively worked on.
So that is actively worked on. Changes can happen to it. There's changes happening to it. So I think for those listening that aren't familiar with Mini Magic and the gems, that's we're talking about things in the Ruby world at the moment for those that are in different language environments. So do you use the term technical debt at all in your career?
I avoid that word. So, I mean, in my most recent job at Rent the Runway, our leadership team, the executive team, are not primarily tech based. I feel like words like tech debt, especially when communicating outwards, it's just such a catch-all term for so many different things that it's much more useful to take a second and define what you're referring to. So are you talking about, we don't have enough test coverage? Is it overcomplicated code? Is it a particular repository or service that you're having issues with? Is it an architectural issue that needs to be addressed? I feel like, tech debt is this sort of abstract thing, and you can it can be so many different things that it's easier to bemoan the existence of tech debt than have a plan. If it is a small enough project or organization that tech debt is, when you say it, you're like, I'm just going to pick on Haml, this project I've been trying to revive recently. It uses regular expressions as its parser. It doesn't have a real parser inside of it. And that is a bit of tech debt. I wrote the first regular expression parser for it because I didn't know how to write a proper parser. And, over the years, it grew into, having all the complexity that's in there. And I consider that tech debt. If I'm talking to somebody else who works on Haml, I can use that word and they know actually exactly what I'm talking about. They know where the problems are. But that's just because it's straightforward and everybody's familiar. In organizations would, you have 200 developers and, we recently run through, we have 58 internal services. Tech debt is just such a amorphous, are you talking about the way that we have too many API calls, the caching infrastructure, keeping our dependencies updated, security, like where are we even talking? So that's a very long answer, but I don't like that term in complex environments with complex problems, because you should really figure out what words you should use that mean the highest value areas.
I would imagine that, in those types of environments where you've got like that many different services and a lot of developers, and there's other stakeholders that are working on, like, they're looking at what are you contributing to the product or new features, and how do you bundle in those types of conversation as on the technical side of it? Like, well, in order for it to do this, we're going to need to do some refactoring, or we're going to need to update some dependencies, or we're really hitting some friction over here. Do those get added as like tickets or stories into some big backlog or something? And how do you navigate that effectively, or how do you coach the team on how to like have those conversations with stakeholders that are kind of like, well, what am I getting for that?
I mean, I would say it's never enough. First of all, as a technical leader, like if I put on my programmer hat or architect hat, it's never done, right? Like especially in a complex environment, like there's so much that I want to invest in. Then, as a leader, you have to put on your business hat, and, we need to have deliverables. If you have a service that, all it does is, let's say, take uploads of an image file, and it doesn't need to do anything else, it doesn't need to scale, and it's not been touched in forever. Like, is that worth investing in or not? Because I think, and I'm answering this from a sort of senior leadership perspective, because I think on a team, you take it, you make it part of sprints. I mean, there's lots of techniques for doing that. But I think when you're looking at from like a meta perspective, like big investments, words like investment are the right one to use. So I'll take as an example, there was we're just talking about Rent the Runway, which I'm no longer at Rent the Runway as of 4 weeks ago. But, there was one service that it processed payments, right? It had, when I started 3.5 years ago, it just, nobody wanted to touch it. It was considered the scary monster that it handles order processing and just,
don't fuck it up.
Just like people were going in there, and what they would do is if you needed a new endpoint or to change behavior, they'd copy paste an endpoint and then just modify the one line, and they knew that they had not messed up the original callers, and they knew that they had done it right. But, they ended up with 4 copies of the primary endpoint that were mostly the same. But, what we ended up doing is, obviously, as a growing business, something like order management is the most important thing you're doing when you're processing orders. So it's just not acceptable as a business to not have people be familiar with it, understand why that's getting called, and be able to live in it. So, we put together actually a couple teams to kind of go full time on working through what would broadly be called tech debt there. But really what it was is the business needed those capabilities. Like, we knew that we wanted to offer new membership types, and the tax rules as you get bigger get crazier, and there's ERP systems and tons of stuff. And it's just not acceptable to go up on it. So, I think the word investment applies not just to features, but to dealing with the maintenance and how well maintained a particular repository is. I'm just using the word repository, but it could be anything.
Right. What are some of the technical hurdles that you've personally needed to kind of get over or climb over when you've been dealing with, say, older, I emphasize older code bases?
So many. I mean, I've worked on a lot of different systems, and I honestly think each one can be a little bit different, especially if you're where you're at on the microservices to monolith and sort of what the deployment patterns are. So are you API? Are you back-end engineering? Are you front-end engineer? Work on a website? Are you working on a mobile app? I think all of these have kind of different technical challenges. One of the ones that comes to mind was, every time you choose a technology or a design, just generally speaking for any piece of software, right, you're making trade-offs. There are selections you make in how it is built that you work towards, what you think the goal is, right? And so I was CTO of a company called MoveWeb that's definitely still around, but about 8 years ago. And, when I first joined, they had just signed Macy's to power their whole mobile experience, and, got a big check for it because this is before responsive was anywhere near powerful enough. like 8-9 years ago, there wasn't, responsive was very difficult. And I'd been at the Wikimedia Foundation building their mobile experiences. And so, I got this job and I walk in. It's really cool system, but it was built in Ruby, which, as we brought up, I have a history in Ruby. But the problem was that this needed to be, the design of the system was that every time you browsed on a mobile device, a website, every request would get transformed and customized in transit back to the user. So imagine a CDN, but that CDN being in the middle actually changes the content itself on the fly, and needing to do that at incredible scale. Because we ended up, during my time there, by the time I left, we powered half of the IR 500, which is like the internet retailer. So it's just basically like huge volumes. And we knew that this when I came in, they had a prototype in Ruby, which is a great prototyping language. But for all Ruby strings, it is not what you use for a massively concurrent, globally distributed CDN. Like, that is just not the language is built on, expressiveness, and, it's kind of a memory hog, but it's got nice dynamic aspects. And so, I very quickly realized and had to make a pitch to we just signed this big customer, and make the pitch that we needed to actually rewrite the entirety of the platform. And that was a difficult pitch to make. Luckily, we did decide to do it, and actually it worked, which, generally speaking, in my career, and I think everybody's careers, the big rewrite is the worst idea anybody's ever had. It's only when the fundamental technology choice from scratch was just not appropriate. So what we ended up doing was, it worked like basically had an SDK. So developers, we had like a language and some stuff. So you would kind of customize the site and can change things. And so what we did was said, for the next 6 months, you can continue to sell the product. We can launch new sites, but we are not going to add functionality to the core platform at all. 0. If you want to scale this thing, we cannot add anything. And then to the development team, the marching orders I gave them was, you have to make the new application, which we chose Go before 1.0, which that's a brave choice in retrospect. We chose Go because high concurrency, very fast, native compilation, all sorts of nice things. I was like, you have to make it act exactly like the Ruby application. Every single aspect of it has to be 100% compatible, including the logging format. So we have to build a Go logger that looks and feels and logs exactly like the Ruby application. What that did was, it was able to focus the team on, success was clear. It was clear what success was. Because if you, don't define the problem really clearly, for engineers, it's very difficult. Like, oh, maybe we should add new features. Maybe we should do this. Maybe, I heard about a new logger. I even made them, because we had a DevOps team that was, keeping up with the success of the business as best they could. And, they were underwater. And they had gem-based deployments, because it started with Ruby, which that's Ruby's kind of package manager. And I made the development team package their Go library inside of a gem, with the same version numbers and everything, so that literally nothing in our deployment pipeline needed to be aware that this was an entirely different rewrite. So about 5 months later, actually took less time than we had allotted, we were able to roll it out to all of our customers. Nobody understood it was happening in the background, because once again, it did exactly what we had. We built a test suite to just ensure perfect matching. And actually it did. One thing went wrong, and that was we deployed out to the first couple servers, and the memory footprint just started just screaming high. It just would kill the box in just 10 minutes. And we're like, what's going on? I can't replicate this locally. And part of the fun of being in that era and with a pre 1.0 Go, the garbage collection didn't work on 32-bit machines. And it just so happened that the servers they had spun up before were 32-bit. And so the application worked fine, except it was just the garbage collector, which is so strange to me. I never got a full answer on how something, would totally run on a 32-bit box that was compiled for 64-bit. except for the garbage collector being the exact one thing it wouldn't do. But so the DevOps team did have to actually go upgrade all the boxes to new 64-bit images, which they wanted to do anyway, but that was the only... I think it took that delayed by about a week. We're like, okay, roll back. Let's go figure this out.
I'm assuming that, that kind of scenario where, as you mentioned, like big rewrites are notoriously a negative experience. Like maybe just to kind of simplify that, but but having that kind of very clear expectations of like making sure things match up. Were you able to do something? Were you able to roll that kind of approach out like over a phase to see is like things matching up, like the logs are still matching, or did you any sort of? I know there's been some examples where I've seen people talk about how they'll still be serving things through both in parallel, but then they can compare, or maybe having a request hit both and make sure that they're matching the responses and everything between both environments before they fully turn that on to all traffic hitting through it.
One of the nice parts about this, which once again, the way we had also architected this system was that it was stateless. So basically given what we called a slug file, which was the instruction set, which was actually protocol buffers. So we would build a whole object tree of the instructions and then serialize it to disk as a protocol buffer binary. So given one of those and a domain and a request coming in or out, actually, you can do it as a functional test, right? So, if I'm doing a stateful web application or something, right? One-to-one parity, things in production can definitely be different in subtle ways. Maybe you have users that have states that you didn't test in your test suite. But luckily for us, what we basically did was took production traffic in the Ruby system and then just wrote it all to disk, given this instruction set of slugs, and then given this, request and response, what is the output? And what is the log output? And write both those down. So we sort of collected a library of all of our customers' traffic. And then as the developers were working, they're able to use that as basically their test library. So we were able to run that against that. So we actually didn't, I think we had pods in different geographies. So we definitely deployed out a new pod. So, and traffic was going to we couldn't really control that. But we didn't actually, aside of going to the sites and making sure that nothing broke, we were confident enough that the constraints on the system allowed it to work, which, honestly, anytime you can remove complexity or a variable in anything you're doing with tech, jump at it. Only add complexity where you need it. And for this particular instance, what the complexity we needed was global distribution. We terminated Walmart's SSL cert with credit cards going through it. It would get processed, and then we'd re-encrypt it with we were a sophisticated man-in-the-middle attack. The customers knew about, right? We needed this to be something that, the security heads at companies like Macy's and Walmart and other big retailers were comfortable with. So, for us, it was almost like simplifying that to be the small, this application could not do anything that wasn't this one task. So, but that's not normal, right? So I'm founding a company called Veue, Veue. And, it's much more a traditional web application. It's in the video streaming space, though. So I'm trying to isolate as much of the complexity. The application itself, haven't really been involved in the Rails Ruby community for about 5 years. Been in more the Java React universe. But with this particular project, the requirements around it, are that the video streaming aspect is very complex, but everything else is user management. It's just normal sort of website-y things. And it's Rails and just going stock Rails with exactly everything that a normal Rails developer would do removes a lot of complexity of a certain type, right? The risks are gone from that because it's I can go hire a Rails developer. This doesn't need to be complicated. But what needs to be complicated? The video streaming aspects. And
right.
I'm not putting that through Rails, but that's its own thing. And keeping that as separate as possible is just really important because there's the essential complexities and those should be your only complexities if you can. Now, obviously, when you're walking into tech debt, I'm saying that now I have a green field and I get to build something. But, my other jobs, when you walk in with a system that you didn't get to design from the beginning, or maybe the requirements weren't totally known at the time, you don't have that luxury. So you're kind of well, I guess we're microservices now. Don't know if we need it, but we are. So, and that's a lot more complicated. So I'm feeling pretty lucky these days because it's just such a simple app.
That's great. What's your take on the balance between microservices and the monolith and hybrid environments? Do you have a strong opinion on that? Do you think teams maybe prematurely optimize that?
Yes. Sorry, I have so many feelings and thoughts on that question. Yeah, I don't think that there's a universal answer at all. I think extreme or exclusive thought on either side isn't constructive, because I believe that somebody who says, I will only have a singular monolith and I could never consider breaking it into two. Now, by the way, that person doesn't exist, but the opposite does exist, which is every small function should be a different lambda that's entirely separate, and I'll have 6,000 lambdas all in different repos, and I'll use different programming languages, and I will never tell a developer what programming language to use. I've definitely talked to those people. Both, that's not useful, right? It's just not. And I think fashion, it tends to just swing back and forth between the two. And I do think we're moving back towards things that are closer to a monolith, but every time it shifts a little, what do you even consider a monolith, right? These aren't single-threaded applications running on one server. That's not what's happening. And even so there's a project called booster.cloud, and it's done by a group of engineers that I've worked with a lot called the Agile Monkeys, and it's basically a singular repo. It feels kind of like a monolith in that you're writing in one place. But what it actually does is really interesting. To deploy your application, you kind of use their standards inside there. And then what it actually does is goes out into Google Cloud and AWS and sort of orchestrates and creates lambdas and all the crazy whatevers that are needed for a super ultra scalable non-singular application. So it's this sort of hybrid thing where you're your test suite's all here and I'm developing it as if it was a hybrid, and it's all in one language, and it has kind of very clear data store. You have to put a lot of constraints to make this work, but it's kind of CQRS stuff. I'm not sure if you're familiar, control systems, but if you're willing to kind of think of it that way and use GraphQL, you get this crazy cloud expression that would be, if you were hand building an absolutely insane number of sort of microservice worlds. To me, I kind of think of that like a monolith-ish, but it is sort of taking the lessons from the sort of cloud native environment, a lot of the stuff we've learned about microservices. My personal preference is, it's mind-blowing. It's called service-oriented architecture. And basically, you put enough complexity that one fully staffed team of about 10 would be able to support it. And sometimes it can be a monolith and you sort of break it up so that internally there's different areas that function as services. Or you can actually totally launch them separately if that helps and gives you gains. I think the middle, honestly, is where it's at. But as I'm starting a project right now with me and just a couple other developers, we're just building in Rails. It's a monolith. But later, will our processing pipeline for the interactive chat, if we become as successful as Twitch, yeah, I'm probably going to go pick something like Go or Rust or something to build a, fiber-based threaded multi-tenant event source system. But not today because I don't need to. So I shouldn't, that would just increase the complexity and the risks. And that doesn't serve the purpose.
Especially in that early era of trying to get to that product market fit, and you're in that startup phase. And so, I talk with teams sometimes where okay, we're 6 months into this project, we're not quite launched yet. And then they'll ask us to come in and take a look at their code or something and provide some consulting or even maybe help contribute to the project. Then I'm how have you already broken this down into so many different microservices at this point? You haven't even launched this thing yet. And they're well, we're just planning ahead. I'm you don't even know if you're going to be in business in a year. So is this faster? Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a debatable conversation for people that are more familiar with doing that, but it is an interesting paradigm shift to go from what do we need to get this thing launched and to see if we get customers and to adapt quickly, is now do we have a scaling problem? Because at first you're scaling to customer one, right? So depending on your type of application you're building, I suppose, but.
Yeah, I have just spent the last 3.5 years of my life shepherding and attempting to address the tech debt of a, 8 years later, what's the result of starting that way? I will tell you it's a mistake. It adds a lot of complexity because there are ways to do microservices really well, even early. But the constraints you have to put on it are extreme. Like complexity will spiral out of control. Like you really have to be super strict. And I think the testing story is really important. You have to come with something that, I'm just going to use the phrase naive microservices. So you're just building some node apps. Let's go with that. Like they're just, simple, and maybe they have a couple tables, and, you're just using like REST API calls with some JSON, right? So you're doing like just really simple, 2 services call back to each other. You build 10 of them, they're all talking to each other. If you haven't built the ability to totally, absolutely ensure that a change in service A will not break service B, and that you can solve that to the level of like when I was talking about how we were able to run that test suite and just 100% know it's perfect. If you don't have enough tools, processes, protocols, whatever you want to pick, I don't know, you address it however, that even going into the future, you can predict with certainty the state and functioning of the system. If you don't have that fully answered, do not do that. Now, there's a bunch of tools out there that can help, right? There's like cool networking protocols, there's like Envoy stuff that you can do, there's like really cool integrated test contracts between API. I mean, there's like, you got a universe of cool tools, and you probably need 3 or 4 of them if you're going to do that. But I think when microservices go really wrong is when you actually think that low overhead will work. Because all you've done is taken, it's bad if you have a single repository or application that's calling 2 bits of code and it's hard to figure out what it's doing. It's even worse when they're in 2 different repositories. They don't share the same test cases. And especially over time, so it was written by somebody who you don't know. So the assumptions they made, the design they had in mind, even if they documented it, like I have spent way more time writing documentation than reading it in my applications. And I don't think I read MDN all the time, Mozilla Developer Network. But it's tough when you're starting on a new project. You're like, oh, good, I found an old PDF that's got 20 pages of stuff, and your eyes start to glaze over, and you're like, I'm just going to go look at the code. The point is, it's very difficult to replace microservices later. I mean, I can promise you that the promise that if you keep it simple, you can drop in and rewrite it quickly is not true unless you have it's done by the person who originally wrote it.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the open source projects that you've been heavily involved in and created over the years. And I know you mentioned projects that you've also just jumped into and helped later on after they're built. But in particular, at least within the Ruby community, you're known for having created Haml and Sass, which is not exclusively remotely a specific thing for the Ruby community at this point. Before I wanted to dig into Sass a little bit deeper, but what is Haml?
Yeah, so Haml, it's an interesting story. I struggled for a lot of years after dropping out of college in the early 2000s to get any job anywhere. Trust me, after the dot-com bust, hey, I promise I'm a good developer and I don't have a college degree was not a look that was okay. It would be much better today, but back then that was really rough. And I got really lucky and met a team of people at a company called Unspace who gave a chance on me basically and hired me as their first engineer. And enough time has passed now that I can say this without going to jail. I was living in Canada, I'm not Canadian, and I did not have a work visa. So I was technically both an illegal immigrant and illegally hired. But 10 years is their...
statute of limitation?
Yeah, we're good. So now when I started working there, I noticed, we were growing really fast. It was the early days of Rails. I really kind of jumped into that early. I was in my kind of early 20s. Finally making money. It was amazing. I could afford stuff. It was great. And one thing I noticed, I'm definitely more of a back-end engineer, just generally speaking, despite the fact that most of the open source work I've done and most of what I'm responsible for is in the front end. But I had a team of people who were working for me, and at the time, semantic HTML was the rage, which basically is using classes and IDs and different tags inside your HTML to give sort of a true meaning of what the thing is. So instead of just styling something and make it red, you say it's important or something, right? You give the meaning behind it. And that was all the rage. But I had, a CSS implementation team at the time, which back then, before Sass, CSS was literally one big file that your developer who did it just edited something in this giant file and they copy and pasted all over to make it work. Like, it was just flat. It was insane. No pipelines. We didn't have Webpack. We didn't have any of that. Like, just a file that gets downloaded by the browser.
Yeah.
And the sort of more back-end engineers would write HTML, and like they would just kind of dump gross HTML into the page. Like, it was all crazy. Tags weren't closed properly. Nothing had a good class name on it. They were just throwing in the data from the back end into this sort of like thing, and then they just toss it over to the front end team. And it drove me crazy because I wanted something really simple. I feel like annotating the meaning of your code and what you're building, even if semantic HTML as a sort of trend is less of a thing now, it's still, actually I think today every single developer on the front end now, we think about components, we think about encapsulation, we think about all these things, reusability, right? Like, that's much more common today. And so I was just like, I took a beautifully, in my opinion, beautifully written bit of HTML using ERB, which is the default template system in Rails, and it just looks like PHP. So if you're used to PHP, that's what it looks like, old school PHP. And I just started deleting stuff, and I wanted to get rid of as much cruft as possible to see what I ended up with. And so what I ended up with was sort of a CSS-inspired, structured, aka indented, prototype. Like, I really just started going like, don't need the div. Divs are what you should use all the time. Class equals hello. No, we're going to turn that into dot hello. So that sort of thing. And I ended up just writing this document. And then I sat there and I just wrote a regular expression to parse it, like I was saying. And then ended up figuring out how to, get it to be a rendering engine in Rails. And, I was hoping that sort of focusing on the structure, what's inside of what, make sure it's all well indented. The sort of marketing phrase for Haml is it's markup haiku, because it's fairly short and it's like just distilled down to what's important, or at least that's the hope of the design. A funny story that's designed for people who still use Haml. If you write a tag name, so if I'm going to use a video tag, for instance, today, you have to do % video. That's the way to say I'm using a tag that is not a div. The reason why it's %, which is an ugly looking character, was actually, at the time, it was out of fashion to use custom tags for anything. Very out of fashion. So I made it the furthest you could reach with a single hand to the top of your keyboard to be the most awkward character to type. That wasn't the caret is on 6, which is a little further on a US keyboard, but the % is on 5. So you've got to stretch. Most people use the left shift, so you have to do this with your fingers. And that was actually intended to be a mechanical design choice into the text of the language to change people's behavior and discourage my team from using tags they shouldn't use, and make it easier to type a class name. Now, unfortunately, for Haml and myself that I'm now torturing people, HTML5 onwards, is if you haven't gone the React route as much and you're more focused on browser stuff, we use crazy new tags all the time. So sorry, Haml users, if you're stretching your fingers all the time. So I ended up, we released that as an open source project. Ryan McMahon, who I worked with at the time, bought me flights to London to go announce this thing. And I had just been jobless, like without a career just before this. And I remember I was in London at, I think it was RailsConf EU or Europe or something. I think this was 2007, maybe 2006. And like, I'm giving my talk. I had just gotten a mohawk because I needed some confidence. So I kind of like made myself look cooler than I actually am. And DHH walks into the room, who I was, he was just becoming a big deal at that point, the creator of Rails, sorry. And he like sits down like right in front of me. And I like nearly had a heart attack. So he sat down right in front of me and, there weren't markup languages. Like that is Slim didn't exist. I mean, at this point, every single language and ecosystems has that. Haml was absolutely, totally the very first sort of markup language for HTML out there. There weren't templating engines that did funny things. Everything roughly looked like PHP, or at least inspired by that. And so, here I am like proposing this like totally weird thing. And I nearly lost my mind. But luckily, you know, people started getting really interested in it. And at that point, I started having, it was still Subversion. You know, Git wasn't really a thing, and GitHub definitely didn't exist. So we started having this random person started adding features to Haml that went by Next3. It took a while. It took about 6 months till I like finally was like, like, who are you? Hey, thanks for all the help. Like, you're doing great work. And it ended up being Natalie Weizenbaum. And at the time, she was 16 years old and in university, like everybody was at 16. I was like, oh, you're a 16-year-old. Cool. Did not expect a 16-year-old to be the person who was, you know, rewriting all my crappy code in Haml and adding features. Natalie, you know, we ended up at Unspace, so we're these guys in Toronto, and she was in Seattle, and we wanted to take her to RailsConf, and I guess it must have been 2008. We literally, Ryan McMinn, the managing partner at Unspace, had to get on the phone with Natalie's mom to ask, can she come, can we buy her a flight to, I think it was San Diego or something. Yeah, I think it was San Diego, whatever year that was. Can we buy your daughter, who's 16, a flight down to come hang out with some dudes from Canada at a conference, and we're going to buy her a ticket. And her mom's like, I mean, to her credit, like, we're nice, we're nice people, we're not trying to kidnap her. And it was actually at that conference that I hid on the way there on a flight. I'd sort of prototyped what a CSS version of Haml would be like, because I realized that CSS didn't have variables, it didn't have nesting, it didn't have a ton of features. So, you know, I'd helped our our CSS developers at Unspace by having their markup be prettier on the HTML side, but we didn't have anything. And actually, I would look at their code, and their CSS, they would manually add all the classes together. So you just do like .hello, .something else, next line down, .hello, .something. Like, it was just, and it was a find and replace was how you would change a color. Find and replace was the only tool in the CSS developers tool chain. So yeah, I wrote up a quick little thing. I wrote up some sample code of what I thought this language could be like. And then while at that conference, Natalie and I grabbed a like side room at RailsConf, and there was actually a whiteboard in there, which was super weird. It was just like some random room at the convention center. And I started whiteboarding out what I thought it could be like. And she got really excited about it, and then ended up on the flight home from RailsConf that year, before the plane landed, she had implemented a working version of Sass, which was a submodule of Haml initially. It was the first CSS preprocessor. It was actually the first, I think, preprocessor of any sort. I don't know how I keep finding myself in these really weird thinking outside the box world places, but yeah, it was basically the first one. Like I said, we didn't even have like the idea of a asset pipeline or modifications you would do to your CSS or JavaScript or anything. That just didn't exist. Just we didn't have those at the time. And so, you know, Sass was definitely, oh gosh, this is a funny story. I remember when we were first telling people about Sass, one of the things they kept thinking it was, I'd say, oh, there's variables, right? So you can set it to a color and use it. And they're like, oh, so this is like dynamic. Like, you can use this to customize, like click, kind of change the color of the background. Like, they were thinking it was more like a living document sort of in the browser. They didn't understand, like, it was really hard to explain to people. It was one of the biggest things to explain, that actually it would output CSS. Like, this wasn't some different, this was a language that turned into a target language. And like, it's so funny looking back, because like now that is like, I mean, I write ES6 code and Babel all the time, and I just know it somehow magically gets turned into minified, web-packed, cross-compiled, 16 filters happen with a polyfill, and like, that's just, everybody works that way now. But back then, that was just like not, the idea that a target was a compatible concept didn't exist. And so, yeah, I mean, people started to get it though once they actually were writing CSS. Anyhow, so obviously Sass has gone on to, you know, we had times where we were the most popular in the world. A couple other technologies came along, supplanted us, and we became sort of the back burner as a CSS language. But at this point, I mean, we de facto standard, which is really weird. Like, Google uses it, Microsoft uses it, it's just a standard language now, which is strange. And I really want to be super clear. That is actually, Natalie still works full time on it, She works for Google on the Dart team, and she has added all the amazing features to the language. I mean, we have other people on the team too, but Natalie is absolutely the reason why this language is what it is. I just provoked her into to doing this. And, actually, I'm going to follow on with, I'm going to make up a question right now, which is, maintainability is the reason why Sass is the dominant language now. And we're now on our third full rewrite, different platform for the actual compiler. But Natalie is so specific and so cautious about, and very clear, very deliberate about every feature that gets added. Like, we don't add features as quickly as other languages did. So there was a couple other, kind of competitors who, came out and added features that, we've ended up adding some similar features, but they ended up just kind of like piling on, oh, you can do this and you can do that. Anything will work, and you can use brackets and not brackets and this and that. Like, Natalie's just really clear. Like, there are threads on the GitHub for the main Sass repo where just for years people asking for something. Like, actually, import once. That feature was requested for like 8 years. Like, it's probably that thread, everybody's just like, please give me import once. Because originally, Sass, when it runs upon an import, will go grab a local file and just process it. So, you can get infinite loops. You can import things multiple times and have repeating CSS accidentally. And so people are like, please allow us just to do import once. Why are you doing this? And Natalie just always was like, no, we need to think through a module system that really makes sense for CSS. And we need to move away from even the term import. We will get to this eventually. Like, just so years and years of people begging, and fast forward to now, like, Natalie has built the new module system. If you're not using Dart Sass, if you're still using the libsass project that actually, that's a whole maintainability story also. But Dart Sass, the newest, reference implementation for Sass compiler, it's the only one that has modules with @use and @forward. And it is a beautiful design. I mean, I actually only recently, I have not been an active developer for a while, and with this new startup, I'm back to it. I've actually used it now for the first time as an actual developer. It's fantastic. Like, I'm like, oh, that's why she thought through this thing until it just made sense with a period on the end of it. And, those other languages that added features faster, they ended up making mistakes. And sort of once you add something to a language, you can't undo it. It's very, very, very difficult. So kudos to Natalie. Check on the module system with Dart Sass.
Thanks for giving a good kind of sharing your story behind how those two projects were kind of. It's interesting is like there's always this, you mentioned like there's that train or the flight back was when you kind of created that initial concept for Sass, or at least put together a prototype. There's a lot of those stories out there about like how open source projects start. They're usually not this like pre-planned, like, oh, I'm going to do this and everybody's going to be using this one day. I feel like I rarely hear that. Like our spec in the Ruby community, that was started on a train trip that my company helped organize to go from Portland to Chicago for the very first RailsConf. And Stephen Baker and a couple other people were on the train trip, started coming up with this idea for using our spec with Rails and stuff. And so it's always like this fun little like piece of history within the community. I'm like, oh yeah, that was just on a train ride. People were kind of like thinking it through this thing, and now it's like. It's what most people write their test work in the Ruby on Rails community these days. But so for those listening that are curious about starting open source projects, you might have that success one day of having a project that does grow and is widely used. But quite often it's just those little like creative ideas that people have. And like, let's see if I can make this one thing a little bit more efficient or improve the maintainability of something. Or like, I remember when we first started using tools like Sass, and I think Les at one point as well, within our own team here on projects, there's the ability that you could copy and paste like existing CSS file into something and not do anything yet, and it still worked. It's like, okay, cool, it processed something. That was really great. And like, oh, now I've got variables, and then like the front end team was like, they got really excited about that. Like, oh my gosh, Haml was a different beast on our end. I remember early on, because it was like, we had front end developers that were like, they knew their HTML and like, well, I can put in placeholder stuff here. And then the backend developers can put in some of the dynamic things. And that was like the little trade, like who's responsible. Like it was a shared working space. And I remember those first couple of projects where we would inherit a project using Haml, and the front end developers would be like, what the hell is going on here? like their mental model just kind of blew up a little bit, but they got over it, and and now we have front end developers that prefer to use that. And then where 12 plus years ago, I remember people being like, this is too complicated for me.
Yeah, Haml is a very divisive technology. Like, how many times, like, I'm at a conference and somebody like come up to me and they're like, "Hey, yeah, nice to meet you. I have to tell you, I hate Haml." I'm like, "Oh, well, nice to meet you too. I'm glad that you hate Haml." Yeah, and actually, so you mentioned there just a little bit. There were two big resets that we did with Sass, kind of fundamental bets and risks that we took. Well, one was originally, it was white space sensitive. You could not copy properly formatted CSS directly into the original version of Sass. Yeah, this still causes confusion. Like, people say, "Oh, I'm not a Sass developer, I write SCSS." Well, SCSS stands for Sass CSS. It's the standard syntax now. But it used to be, it didn't have the curly brackets. There was no semicolon at the end. And then it was some other languages like Less came out that were more compatible with CSS, which
I might be mistaken now. Now that you're saying that, I'm like, maybe that was what the team was first using. I think that might be accurate. So,
well, yeah, I mean, it was the first one. Like, so some people are using Sass, but a complaint was that at the time, it wasn't compatible with CSS. You couldn't just drop it in. Your whole team had to write Sass or not write Sass, because you could convert it CSS into the indented version. We had a converter, but then you basically had to get all five. If you had a team of five, you're like, okay, everybody, we're using this new thing now. And all it took was one person to be like, "Don't touch my files." Maybe they actually changed too. They might have started. I don't remember perfectly, but we lost a lot of market share because everybody was like, "Oh my gosh, I like it so much better. I can just paste it in totally," and it totally dawned on us. We're like, that is better. So it's funny that sort of lesson, I would say it was a lesson, taught us something that is still a big design feature of Sass, which is that we don't want to know about CSS and we want to leave CSS as much alone as we can. So we work very carefully, especially Natalie with the W3C working group, to make sure that what characters on the keyboard and symbols are they interested in the CSS working group, and how are they thinking about things, just to make sure that we are not ever going to introduce something that we end up being not compatible with. And that, obviously the first version didn't even really look like CSS that much. So, we didn't have that. But then it was like when we first had the syntax for SCSS, that's the CSS compatible one, that's standard now. Yeah, it was a philosophical change. And actually we've stuck with that much more strictly than other languages. We almost swung entirely the other way. And the other thing was, the original implementation was in Ruby. The original one was inside Haml. We ended up pulling it out into its own, but it was primarily the Ruby world. If you wanted to use this and you were writing a Java application or a PHP application, you could either use probably a not very well implemented PHP fork that somebody had, or a different language, but you wouldn't really go install the 200 megabyte Ruby interpreter on your machine, and it's not part of your pipeline or your deploy or anything. It was a lot to ask. So I was actually at the same time I was at MoveWeb when we were working on that CDN system. I got permission from our CEO, Ajay Kapoor, to basically have an engineer work full-time on building a C port, or C++ really, port of Sass called libsass that would be much faster than the Ruby implementation. But more importantly, C is something that is incredibly portable. So you can, if something's written in C, I can wrap it in a Node package and then put that right into the Node environment. I can put it right into PHP. I can put it into Python. I can put it into Ruby. All those are totally easy, actually. Pretty easy to build a bridge between the two. So we sort of, did the crazy task of building in one of the most difficult languages out there. C++ is not user-friendly. And I will tell you the biggest challenge with that is that people who write C++ don't know about or care about Sass. And people who write Sass are the furthest from the type of person who likes writing C++. So libsass is the dominant implementation right now of Sass. But we are going to be deprecating it fully shortly, because I'm not a good C++ developer. I can't do it. And Dart Sass, as I said, one with modules is is actually has a portability story now to Dart as a language that we can actually start embedding it into things like Ruby gems and Node modules. So if you're using Node Sass, you're using lib Sass behind the scenes, and it doesn't have a lot of features, and there's a couple of quirks about it that are very difficult to fix. And there's been a great team working on that, by the way. Marcel Grieder especially, they've been working on that project for years, and it's great. But it's just, speaking of maintainability, it's incredibly hard to maintain that project and keep interest on it, which is why we're sort of flipping over to this new platform, thanks to, I think Google has 3 or 4 engineers now working full time on that implementation. So it's really, really quite cool. But those are 2 big bets. And I think both of those are what has made us into the primary language. I think doing the lib Sass thing was required because it got us into every ecosystem, right? So if you were writing Python one day and then you went to a Java project, you can use the same language, right? We're not going to stop you. But now we're having to keep the same portability story. We're just going with a very different language.
We'll be back with our interview with Hampton in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to Maintainable. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers on social media or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Also, do you know someone in the industry that I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview with Hampton Lintorn Catlin. I really appreciate you kind of digging into sharing those background stories and on these projects. And it's always interesting to, as someone that helped be around during the origin of those projects and knowing that there's now people full-time working on those projects, getting paid to work on it and contribute back to the community. That's pretty awesome to I would imagine that's being pretty awesome. I don't have that sort of, quite that sort of experience with my open source projects. I've been just so people use some of my open source projects, like Oh My Z Shell is like one of the ones. And there's people that are working on it, they don't get paid for it necessarily or anything, but there's a lot of people that use it every day. And that I enjoy being part of that experience. And it's not something I ever manifested. Like, I think, just like things have a life of their own sometimes. And it's fun being part of the adventure, I suppose, and kind of see where things kind of take you. I want to thank you for helping. You're thinking about those types of projects and coming up with how can I improve the maintainability, because maintaining HTML files, CSS files, those things were really painful at one point. And I'm also curious if you've seen some as you've worked in these different environments, something that you mentioned, dead code earlier, in terms of code that doesn't get touched very often. Or I think another challenge sometimes we have with projects, regardless, I would imagine across any framework and technology, especially the web technology, finding if there's areas of JavaScript or CSS that aren't even used anymore in the code. Like that stuff seems really tricky to try to track down, and people are nervous probably about deleting sections from a Sass file or a CSS file. I mean, I don't know have you seen much in that space in terms of being able to track kind of usage of those areas in code?
I have not, to be honest. The interface between CSS and the browser is incredibly complicated. And, the fact that the output of HTML is not determinate for the most part. And, from React to any generator, class names can change. There could be, you get the 4th Sunday in February problem where just you have no idea when that code might trigger. It's a rare moment that you have complete predictability in software. And always try to push for that, right? I love that you actually bring this up, because I'm going to kind of pivot this into a mini rant about something kind of different. So you were talking about people starting open source projects. There's 2 ways to do it. And it's going to sound like I'm being a little bit mean about the first category, and maybe I am. But if you want to get started in open source and you haven't done open source, or you're struggling in your career right now to make a mark, there's a guaranteed 100% way for you to have a decent open source project that will get you a job. And that is look into a mature ecosystem. So go look at Ruby or Java or Python, kind of know about it, then go into an entirely new ecosystem. So Rust is very new. Kotlin is sort of emerging. Dart is pretty new. There's some of these that are starting to get attention. Crystal, I don't know, some of these random things. Most of those new ecosystems it's almost like nutrients hitting soil. Those areas tend to have there's a lot of stuff they haven't made yet. So like our spec being an example, behavior or BDD was a trend outside of that. Like I'm not saying our spec isn't great. I use it. It's very good. But like, that is taking a trend or a thing from another universe and bringing it over into we brought into the Ruby world and sort of brought that in. And that is that first category where basically you're porting or you're bringing a capability to an ecosystem that is new. And that is always, be careful about which ecosystem you pick. Make sure they're nice people there. But like I recommend if you have never done an open source project and you've never been involved in a new technology, always go learn those things. And I'm sure Rust needs a BDD plug, like a universe. Like go figure it out and make it native to that. It's very creative because also, languages are different. So it's not like copy paste. There's definitely the matchers in our spec are, very Ruby-like and sort of exist in this metaprogramming universe. Then there's the second category, which is what, Robby, you were just kind of talking about which is just a problem that is so common that we've forgotten about it. Like, there are things that make your job as a developer and other developers around you and people around you. There are millions of things right now that are not optimized that we do, and we don't even know that it's a problem, right? Nobody was walking around going like, oh, I hate my CSS files. But it is about finding those problems, and what you just talked about, one that's huge, that interface between CSS and the browser, and the fact it's very difficult to detect usage patterns or separate things or really understand where things fall. And like that is a problem that, it bugs me, and I've forgotten about it. And so somebody out there listening to this, like, there's tons of problems around you all the time. And that's the whole point of innovation and invention, right? It's finding those problems that you don't even know are problems, and trying to not go blind to them. So like, do you have this? I mean, I think everybody does this. I have this thing where, okay, I have chalk on my desk and it's not near the chalkboard and it's been here for a while and I don't see it anymore. It's just on my desk, right? So you don't see it. Or if something's on the floor and it's been there for a while, you kind of go blind to problems that you see all the time. And I think getting yourself out of that and trying to step back and see what that thing is and try to see the problem and actually notice that there's an issue, that is the first step in inventing. Like, it really is. It's combining the new technologies with a problem that people didn't even know they had. Like, nobody was begging Thomas Edison to make a light bulb, right? They just thought, I've got
candles.
I got candle. That's what we've always had. That's what do you mean? Like, I got kerosene. And so, he was like, we have something better. Like, let's go make something better. And, it's seeing a problem or something that isn't optimized and optimizing it. I hope I'm not too old to, at this point, it's definitely, I think, a little bit easier when you're younger to go totally blind to those, because now I know a lot more, which means I also know how to get used to these problems. And so, but I really encourage people. Like, I really do think that, we can make things better by solving those problems. We can make people's lives better. And that's really what inspires me.
I really appreciate you kind of like sharing like that, those different types of scenarios. Yes, if you're someone that's interested in participating in open source projects, a lot of people don't know where to start. Like especially if they're a junior developer. I'm always like, well, at least contribute back to the documentation. Like, did you hit a problem trying to even use this gem or library they're using, and the documentation was inaccurate, and you've had to work around it? Submit a pull request for that. But then also that other aspect of like, when there's new technology frameworks and tools out there, and like if something new pops up, someone generates a new framework and you think there might be a little bit of momentum behind that, they're going to need credit card processing potentially at some point. They're going to need all these different tools, you're going to have to build that yourself. So if you want to build something that you can repurpose on another project, and then maybe other people might benefit from that, that's a really good way of getting involved. And so you see that happen. I've seen that happen so many times over the years, where there's like, oh, it's someone's mouth, like they made a clone of something in a different technology. It's even happened with my projects too. And like, there's like, oh, my fish, and like, there's like other projects that are kind of doing very similar thing. And I'm like, one part of me is like, why would you do that? Why not just use my thing? But it's also, oh, but you still want to use that other technology. And okay, that makes sense. So that's always really cool to see how that stuff evolves there. You can also go a little crazy, and if you keep reinventing the same type of thing out of your own curiosity, that's another thing. Like when you have choice overload, could be like, which node module, that if there's like 25 modules that do the same thing in theory, which one do I use? And you mentioned earlier about like looking at like gems or seeing if like this is maintained, and then people have to go through and be like, which one has the most recent commit? Is that the way that you make the decision that that's the most reliable dependency to pull into my application? I think that's been a challenging thing, I think, for developers to make sense of. I've seen my own developers dismiss gems because they haven't had any code contributions in two years. I'm like, but is it feature complete? I don't know. It's like, does it do exactly what we needed? Did you look at the library? Like, well, no one's maintaining it. And it's like, we can also maintain it too, because it's open source, right? So like, if it works and we have to fork it and make some updates to it, that might get us a little bit further. So it's a tricky thing, I think, to balance those things there. But
yeah, I think, well, in the same ecosystem, I think is a little different than a separate ecosystem, right? So any project, if they've taken one of your ideas and re-implement it, and especially a different universe, go figure out what's different and steal their good ideas, because things mutate when that happens, especially if it's a different pool, right? Like, there's no reason for me to make a different mini magic. Like, there's none. Like, it wraps the local image magic call, period. That's it. Like, you don't need another one. But, if I'm using Dart, just pick, I don't know, some language, like that probably doesn't exist. And if anything, or like, let's say a functional language, right? Let's say a functional language tried to go wrap FFmpeg, image magic. If they tried to go wrap the command line there, like, I bet the way they would think about that problem is interesting and might actually really influence a rewrite or something we could simplify or take back. Because literally, like I said, less being a mutation, which, yeah, when less first came out, it's like, there's the flattery, but you're like, oh, why do people like that and not my thing? But the fact that without less, like, Sass would not have gotten all those great features and realized our mistake in our design, right? Like, there's lessons there, right? Not just mistakes. And like, do I think that since less is, no longer a sort of major technology, do I think they wasted their time? Like, absolutely not. Like, that was incredible value, and it's a shared value, right? Like, that's the cool part about open source technology, and actually technology, I think, in general, outside of like attempting to patent things, technology being, the plow. Somebody saw somebody with a stick that had a funny shape, and they were able to plow with it. That somebody else took and then made a better plow. And then it slowly, went from a stick to something that you could put on a horse, and then you could drag, and then this is how technology works. And it is always collaborative, even if they're quote unquote copying or competing. And I think that's so cool. I don't know if there's a ton of things in the world that are like that. And, I just really, it's amazing to watch. To me, it's like evolution happening in front of us all the time. I have never once regretted my decision to go into technology. It has taken me to so many different industries, different products, different things, different coworkers, different cultures, different countries. But it's always on the same shared mission of sort of iterating towards the unknown.
Well, I have just a few last quick questions for you. Tell us, you mentioned Veue a little earlier in your new venture, just because high level, what are you working on with that?
Yeah, we're not fully announced. We're kind of keeping it under the wraps, but roughly it is Twitch meets online shopping. So, Twitch with coronavirus and the change, and right now we're on Zoom. Technology that at this moment in time, everybody's on video calls because we're all isolated, trying to stay away from this pandemic, right? And I explain that out loud right now just because people are going to listen to this in the future and not remember how it was right now. But a lot of what we're missing as people is connection and community and interaction. And so streaming media, I think, interactive live video is something that gives a lot of emotional satisfaction to people. And, at this point in time, Twitch is the dominant video platform for live streaming, but it is aggressively about gaming. it's sort of a one lens on the world. And they do have a big category called IRL where people just do all sorts of crazy stuff. But as a platform, it's definitely not what they're going after. They literally even just rebranded their Twitch Prime to be Prime Gaming. Like, they're not thinking about everybody else. And I think that there's going to be a huge movement in a bunch of different verticals and areas to address different markets to sort of bring them that experience that Twitch users get, which I'm a gamer. I love watching Twitch. Like, I play these crazy European grand strategy games like Crusader Kings 2, which if you're incredibly nerdy and want to learn just insane amounts of rules, it's a fun video game. But like, you know, I watch players doing that who are much better than me. It gives me a sense of community and belonging. But my mom does not land on the Twitch homepage and think, this is my community and belonging. And so, you know, I do think not just what we're trying to do, which is kind of go after a sort of particular submarket initially, but I think this needs to be a big tent, really. And I think no matter if my company is a success or not, and I'm fingers crossed, I think that sense of technology bringing people together when we're not physically together is going to be the next big wave of companies and the next big thing, really. And, you know, I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And maybe it's not streaming video. Maybe it's streaming something else. Like, I don't know. But I think it will be human. I think it will be approachable. I think it will be personable. And I think it will make us feel together. And I do feel like these are structural changes, not just short-term changes. That is, I think, this experience of realizing how being together is not something to be taken for granted. And, you know, it has dangers associated with it. And the fact that we have such a global network now called the internet. I mean, can you imagine if this was happening and we didn't have Zoom ready to go as a product, right? Google Meets was there already, it just wasn't used as much. And that we actually all went home and kept working. And the global economy didn't entirely stop, just mostly. But like, technology is going to be that thing, right? We have a plow around and things just changed a little bit. And so now we're going to need to go take these technologies and find ways to bring people together.
That's interesting. And I wish you the best of success with that, and definitely be including links to that so people can kind of sign up and be notified when you launch that. So a couple of quick last questions that I usually ask most of my guests. And do you have a book that you find yourself recommending to people in an industry that's not software focused?
I think the book I always recommend people to read, I mean, it's just fiction, but it's Cryptonomicon by Neil Stephenson. And it is such a wonderful book that bridges a lot of what I was talking about the plow and technology and how thought and ideas spread and are sort of communicable and iterative, and how sort of fomenting revolution with technology is important and how history all ties together. I think that book, and actually that whole era of Neil Stephenson's writings, if you've never read something, and there's another book, Snow Crash, Diamond Age also, those are all sort of play in this whole area of history and belonging and people and community and all the things I was just talking about. So yeah, actually those books, absolutely. I think they're not about software, but they are entirely, in my mind, fiction that is about how we interact with technology and society.
Excellent. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts on software development online?
Twitter at @hcatlin, HCATLIN. I am of the age that I'm still on Twitter, not Snapchatting or TikToking. But yeah, that's where I tweet a lot.
Well, it's been such a delight having you on Maintainable, Hampton. Thank you so much for talking shop with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.